For 250 years, the British royal family has been hiding a secret. A secret so dangerous that painters, historians, and palace officials work together to bury it forever. What if I told you the grandmother of Queen Victoria, whose blood runs through every living British royal today, was black? Her name was Queen Charlotte. Now walk into any royal gallery in England. You'll find dozens of her portraits, but trust me, they don't look like the same woman. Some show African features, a broader nose, fuller lips, darker skin. Others show her looking completely European, as if someone slowly erased her true face. This wasn't artistic freedom, this was a cover-up. They built an empire calling black people inferior, while their own queen carried African blood. But here's the thing they didn't expect. The evidence survived. Stay until the end, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about the British throne. The teenage bride, they couldn't hide. So the story begins in 1761. King George III of England needed a wife, and from a tiny German duchy that most people had never heard of, he chose a 17-year-old princess named Sophia Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. She spoke no English, she had never seen the British court, and she was about to step into one of the most powerful positions in the world. But when Charlotte arrived in England for her wedding, people noticed something immediately, something that would become one of history's most carefully guarded secrets. Now think about this for a moment. Imagine being a teenage girl, ripped from everything you know, sent to marry a king in a country where you can't even speak the language. And when you arrive, people start staring at you. They whisper about your features. They make observations about your appearance that will follow you for the rest of your life. Charlotte was just 17 years old, completely alone, and about to become the subject of the most elaborate cover-up in British royal history. Trust me, the people around her noticed everything. Sir Walter Scott, one of the most famous British writers of all time, didn't hold back when describing Queen Charlotte. He said she had a true mulatto face. That wasn't vague language. Mulatto was the exact term used in the 18th century to describe people of mixed African and European ancestry. And he wasn't the only one. Baron Christian Friedrich Stockmar, a physician who knew the royal family personally, wrote that Charlotte was small and crooked with a true mulatto face. The same word, used again and again. Now here's what makes this even more significant. Charlotte arrived in England at the exact moment when Britain's economy was built on enslaving black people. The transatlantic slave trade was generating massive wealth. Ships left Liverpool loaded with goods, sailed to Africa, and returned with enslaved human beings. And into this empire of human trafficking stepped a queen with African blood, a contradiction so massive that the establishment would spend centuries trying to bury it. But the written observations weren't the only evidence. The most damning proof wasn't found in diaries or letters. It was painted in oil on canvas, hanging in galleries for anyone to see. And what the earliest portraits of Queen Charlotte reveal is impossible to deny. The portraits that told the truth. So now let's talk about the evidence they couldn't destroy. When Queen Charlotte first became queen in 1761, a respected artist named Allan Ramsay was hired to paint her portrait. And what he painted would later become the most controversial proof of her true ancestry. Here's the thing about Ramsay. He was known for painting exactly what he saw. No flattery, no political games, just honest brushwork. And in those earliest portraits, Charlotte's features are unmistakable. A broader nose, fuller lips, a darker skin tone, and a facial structure that clearly shows African heritage. Now there's something haunting about looking at those early Ramsay paintings. You're seeing the real Charlotte, captured before the establishment decided what she was allowed to look like. She looks back at you from across 260 years. Her face tells a truth that powerful people would spend centuries trying to erase. Those paintings are witnesses, silent testimony that survived every attempt to change the story. But here's where it gets interesting. Ramsay painted Charlotte multiple times in her first years as queen, and all of those early portraits show consistent African features. But as decades passed and different painters were commissioned, something strange happened. Charlotte's features became mysteriously more European. Her nose got narrower, her lips got thinner, her skin got lighter. Trust me, by the time you reach her later portraits, you'd never guess you were looking at the same woman. Think about it like this. You've seen celebrity photos that get retouched, where the same person looks completely different after editing. Now imagine that same process happening with paintings over decades, except the goal wasn't to remove wrinkles. It was to remove evidence of African ancestry. Charlotte's portraits are the 18th century version of historical Photoshop, and the editing was done for purely political reasons. Because as the abolition movement grew stronger, Charlotte's African features became increasingly dangerous to acknowledge. The paintings changed because the need to hide her ancestry became more desperate. Art became a tool of historical erasure, but the portraits don't explain where her African ancestry actually came from. The answer requires tracing her family tree back 9 generations to a Portuguese noblewoman with a secret of her own. And what historians discovered about Margarida de Castro e Sousa reveals a direct bloodline connecting Charlotte to Moorish royalty. The Moorish bloodline from Portugal. Now we need to trace where Charlotte's African ancestry actually came from, and the answer takes us back 9 generations to a woman named Margarida de Castro e Sousa. She was a Portuguese noblewoman who lived in the 15th century. But to understand why this matters, you need to understand what Portugal was like in the 1400s. Because Portugal wasn't like other European countries. For over 700 years, the Iberian Peninsula had been occupied by the Moors. These were North African Muslims who ruled Spain and Portugal, and they left a genetic legacy that ran through every level of society, including royalty. Here's what most people don't realize. The Moorish occupation wasn't a brief invasion. It was 7 centuries of shared history, culture, and bloodlines. When historians say extensive mixing occurred, they're describing generations of families, marriages, children, love that transcended the religious and ethnic categories people try to draw today. By the time you get to the 1500s, Moorish ancestry, meaning North African, meaning black, ran through multiple Portuguese royal family lines, including the one that led directly to Queen Charlotte. Trust me, the records are clear. Margarida de Castro e Sousa descended directly from King Alfonso III of Portugal and his mistress Madrigana. And historians now believe Madrigana was a Moorish noblewoman. That African blood passed down through 9 documented generations, until it reached a teenage princess in a small German duchy, a girl who was about to become Queen of England. Think about your own family tree for a moment. Most people can only trace back a few generations before the records get foggy. But Charlotte had royal records tracing her ancestry back 9 generations with full documentation. Her African ancestry isn't speculation, it's genealogical fact. Here's what makes the Portuguese connection even more powerful. In the 1400s, Portugal wasn't trying to hide Moorish ancestry. There was no shame attached to it yet. The racist ideologies claiming black people were inferior hadn't been invented. Those ideas would be created later, specifically to justify the slave trade. Charlotte's Moorish ancestors lived before the world invented the racial categories that would later make her ancestry so dangerous. But knowing she had this heritage raises an even bigger question. In an empire that was enslaving millions of African people, how did the establishment react to having a queen with African blood? The answer reveals one of the most hypocritical cover-ups in human history: the impossible contradiction. By the late 1700s, Britain had a massive problem. The abolition movement was gaining strength. People were starting to question whether it was morally acceptable to enslave human beings. Activists like Olaudah Equiano, a black man who had survived slavery and learned to write, was publishing devastating first-hand accounts of the slave trade's horrors. And Britain's response? They doubled down on racist pseudoscience. They created an entire intellectual framework claiming that black people were biologically inferior, all to justify continuing the trade that made the empire rich. Think about what was happening. Scientists published books arguing that Africans were a separate, lesser species. Philosophers wrote treatises claiming black people lacked souls. Artists created racist caricatures that dehumanized African features. This wasn't casual racism. This was a coordinated campaign to justify the unjustifiable, to make slavery seem natural and necessary. And in the middle of this campaign sat a queen with the very ancestry they were claiming made people subhuman. Trust me, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. The British establishment faced a terrifying reality. Their entire justification for slavery was based on claims of racial superiority. But their own queen had African ancestry. The woman who sat beside King George III, who gave birth to 15 children, who was the grandmother of Queen Victoria. This woman carried the blood of the very people they were enslaving. How do you claim black people are inferior when your queen is literally related to them? The answer is simple. You erase it. Imagine discovering that your company's CEO, who has been making racist policies for years, actually has the same ancestry as the people being discriminated against. The hypocrisy would be staggering, and the cover-up would be immediate. That's exactly what happened with Queen Charlotte. Except the company was the British Empire, and the policy was the enslavement of millions. The erasure of Charlotte's ancestry wasn't just about hiding one queen's heritage. It was about protecting the entire ideological foundation of British colonialism. If they admitted the queen was black, they'd have to admit that the racial categories they invented were lies. Charlotte's hidden ancestry wasn't embarrassing. It was existentially threatening to an empire built on racism. But here's what they couldn't control. They couldn't control how Charlotte herself would respond to knowing her own hidden truth. And based on her actions, it appears the queen knew exactly who she was and quietly defied the empire from within. The queen who knew her own secret. Queen Charlotte would have known her own family history. She would have been aware of the Portuguese ancestry in her lineage and what that meant about her heritage. The royal family kept meticulous genealogical records, and Charlotte was educated about her noble bloodline before she ever arrived in England. The real question is, how did she respond to living in an empire that enslaved people who shared her ancestry? Based on her actions, Charlotte seems to have quietly acknowledged her heritage in ways that would have been radical for a queen in her position. She personally supported Olaudah Equiano and his abolition work. Think about that for a moment. An extraordinary choice for someone whose husband's government was profiting from slavery. Imagine the courage it took to reach out to a former enslaved person while sitting on a throne built on slavery's profits. Charlotte did exactly that. And there's more. Charlotte showed unusual interest in African culture and collected African art at a time when such things were considered primitive by European standards. Some historians have suggested that her famous passion for botany, she helped create Kew Gardens, was influenced by African botanical traditions passed down through her Moorish heritage. She built one of the world's greatest botanical collections, preserving plants from Africa and around the world. A living legacy that still exists today. Now think about what it would feel like to hide a fundamental part of your identity, while everyone around you mocked and dehumanized people who shared that identity. Every racist joke at court, every dismissive comment about African savages, every justification for slavery. Charlotte would have understood exactly what they were really saying. She lived her entire adult life knowing a truth the empire around her was desperately trying to hide. And here's something even more painful. There are accounts of Charlotte facing mockery from the British aristocracy about her appearance. Nobles making cruel comments using coded racist language. She would have understood exactly what they meant, exactly why they were saying it, and exactly what it revealed about her own hidden heritage. The queen sat on her throne, knowing she was being mocked for the very ancestry they were all pretending didn't exist. But Charlotte's most lasting impact wasn't her charity work or her gardens. Her most lasting impact was her 15 children, each one carrying her genetic heritage into future generations of European royalty. What happened when that bloodline spread across centuries reveals why this secret is still dangerous today. The bloodline that never stopped. Queen Charlotte and King George III had 15 children together. Sons and daughters who would grow up to become kings, queens, and the parents of future monarchs across Europe. Her son George IV became king. Her son William IV became king. And her granddaughter Victoria became one of the most powerful monarchs in world history. Every single child carried Charlotte's genetic heritage, including the African ancestry from her Portuguese bloodline. Now, when you realize that Charlotte's blood runs through every British monarch since her time, the scope of the cover-up becomes almost overwhelming. This wasn't about hiding one queen's features. It was about hiding the genetic reality of an entire royal dynasty for 250 years. Every king and queen who followed, every prince and princess born into the House of Windsor, they all carry the same heritage that powerful people have spent centuries denying. And here's something fascinating. Queen Victoria, Charlotte's granddaughter, was reportedly described with similar features. Darker skin for a European royal, broader facial structure. Her nickname in the family was Mrs. Brown, supposedly because of her relationship with servant John Brown. But some historians suggest it was a coded reference to her complexion. Trust me, the patterns don't stop there. Prince Albert, Victoria's husband, also reportedly had Moorish ancestry through his own German lineage. This doubled down on the genetic heritage in their children. Think about your own family for a moment. How traits pass down through generations, sometimes skipping and reappearing in grandchildren or great-grandchildren. Now imagine that your family controlled an empire and had reason to hide certain traits. You'd see the same patterns of inheritance combined with the same patterns of denial. The British royal family's genetics told one story, while their portraits and official histories told another. But here's the most powerful evidence of Charlotte's continuing legacy. The royal family has never authorized DNA testing of her remains. Modern genetic testing could definitively prove or disprove her African ancestry. But the establishment seems terrified of what that test might reveal. If there was nothing to hide, why not test and settle the question forever? The silence speaks volumes. Charlotte's bloodline spread through British royalty for centuries, but the establishment successfully suppressed public knowledge of her ancestry. Then in the 20th century, researchers began piecing together the evidence that had been hiding in plain sight all along. What happened when a Black American historian published the truth in 1940 reveals how deep the resistance to this story really goes. The historians who refuse to forget. In 1940, a Black American historian named J.A. Rogers published a book called Sex and Race. In that book, he explicitly identified Queen Charlotte as having African ancestry. Rogers had spent years researching the hidden African heritage in European royal families. He traced bloodlines that white historians had ignored or suppressed, and his conclusion about Charlotte wasn't speculation. It was based on the same genealogical records, physical descriptions, and portrait evidence that researchers still use today. But here's what happened next. The British establishment's response to Rogers was immediate and devastating. They ignored him completely. He was dismissed as a fringe theorist, a Black nationalist pushing propaganda, someone with an agenda who couldn't be trusted to tell objective historical truth. Think about the irony here. A Black man pointing out that the British Queen had African ancestry was automatically discredited. His race made him suspect of bias, while white historians hiding the same truth were considered objective. But Rogers wasn't alone. In 1999, PBS aired a documentary called Frontline: The Blurred Racial Lines of Famous Families. They investigated Charlotte's ancestry using professional genealogists. They traced her family tree back through 9 generations to Margarida de Castro e Sousa, and they connected her to the Moorish nobility of Portugal. Exactly what Rogers had said 59 years earlier. The British establishment's response to the PBS documentary. The same as their response to Rogers: complete silence. Trust me, this pattern happens all the time. Evidence gets dismissed not because it's wrong, but because the person presenting it belongs to a group that the powerful don't want to believe. Women's accounts of harassment were dismissed for decades as exaggeration. Indigenous histories were called myths, and Black historians documenting African heritage and European royalty were called activists. J.A. Rogers was right in 1940, but being right didn't matter when the people in power didn't want to hear it. The irony is devastating. Rogers was dismissed for being biased because he was Black, while the white historians hiding Charlotte's ancestry were considered neutral. But who had the actual bias? The man documenting evidence from genealogical records, or the establishment protecting a 200-year cover-up? The very racism that Charlotte's story exposes was used to silence the people trying to tell her story. Rogers was dismissed in 1940. The PBS documentary was ignored in 1999. But in the 21st century, new technology arrived that could settle the question forever. Modern DNA testing can trace genetic ancestry with remarkable accuracy. And geneticists have begun examining what the evidence really shows. What science now says about Queen Charlotte's ancestry should end the debate once and for all. The DNA evidence they won't authorize. In the 21st century, genetic testing can trace ancestry with remarkable accuracy. Multiple geneticists have stated that based on genealogical records, Queen Charlotte almost certainly had African ancestry. Dr. Mario de Valdes y Cocom, a historian of the African diaspora, spent years researching Charlotte's genealogy. His conclusion? She was directly descended from a Black branch of the Portuguese royal house. The scientific consensus is clear. Charlotte's African ancestry is documented genealogical fact, yet the British establishment remains deliberately ambiguous. They won't confirm it, they won't deny it, and most importantly, they won't test it. The royal family has never authorized DNA testing of Queen Charlotte's remains. Testing that would definitively prove or disprove her ancestry within weeks. This refusal is itself evidence. If they believed Charlotte had no African ancestry, testing would vindicate them forever. But they won't do it. Trust me, the logic is simple. If you could clear your name with a simple test but refused, everyone would assume you knew the results would hurt you. Silence, when evidence is available, is not neutrality. It's confession. The real reason they won't test. Confirming Charlotte's ancestry would prove every British monarch since 1761 has African heritage. The pure white European monarchy was always a fiction. And in 2018, when Prince Harry married Meghan Markle, this hidden history became more relevant than ever. The Meghan Markle hypocrisy. When Prince Harry married Meghan Markle in 2018, she became the first person of known African-American heritage to marry into the British royal family in modern times. The British tabloids attacked her viciously. They called her exotic. They criticized her looks. They treated her as an outsider, contaminating the pure British royal family, as if black heritage was something foreign being brought in for the first time. The cruelty was relentless and personal. Comments about her hair, her mother, her background. Commentators implied that someone with African heritage didn't belong in the monarchy. But here's the truth they ignored. Every single attack was based on a lie. Meghan wasn't bringing black ancestry into the royal family. It was already there, and had been for over 250 years. Prince Harry himself was already of partial African descent through Queen Charlotte. The entire racist backlash was based on historical ignorance of a truth the establishment deliberately suppressed. Trust me, the hypocrisy is infuriating. The palace could have defended Meghan by acknowledging African heritage was already part of the royal bloodline. But doing so would mean admitting the truth they'd spent centuries hiding. They chose to let a family member be attacked by racists, rather than reveal the secret. And if the British establishment admits Charlotte was black, they have to confront something much more devastating. They have to admit the entire foundation of British colonialism was built on a lie. The lie that built an empire. The British Empire didn't just practice racism. It invented much of the intellectual framework that justified racism for centuries around the world. British scientists, philosophers, and politicians created theories of racial hierarchy. They claimed white Europeans were biologically superior to all other peoples. These ideas justified enslaving Africans, colonizing Asia, extracting wealth from indigenous peoples everywhere. They built the richest empire in human history on one claim: that Europeans had the right to rule. The scale of suffering caused by these ideas is almost impossible to comprehend. Millions enslaved, millions more colonized, entire cultures destroyed in the name of white supremacy. And the entire time this was happening, the very monarchy that presided over it carried the same African blood they claimed made people subhuman. Queen Victoria, Charlotte's granddaughter, ruled as Empress of India over hundreds of millions of colonized people of color, while carrying African ancestry herself. Trust me, this is one of the greatest hypocrisies in human history. Imagine discovering that the family who owned the plantation where your ancestors were enslaved actually shared your heritage all along. The ideology they used to justify owning your family was a lie they knew was false, because they could see the truth in their own mirror. That's what Charlotte's story reveals. Racism was always about power, never about biology, and the people at the top always knew it. If Charlotte was black, then the entire concept of racial hierarchy falls apart. How can you claim Europeans are superior when your own queen doesn't meet your racial criteria? You can't. So you hide it, paint over it, dismiss anyone who mentions it. Because the alternative is admitting that centuries of violence were based on a conscious, deliberate lie. The portraits still exist. The genealogical records are still there. The genetic evidence is available if anyone has the courage to test it. The question isn't whether Charlotte was black. The question is what happens now that the world is finally ready to acknowledge it. Queen Charlotte was black, or at the very least, she was mixed race. And her heritage runs through every living member of the British royal family today. King Charles III, Prince William, Prince Harry, they all carry the same African ancestry that was systematically erased for 250 years. The monarchy that presided over enslaving millions of Africans was itself of African descent. They hid it because admitting it would destroy the lie that made their empire possible. Charlotte's story isn't just about one queen. It's proof that racial categories are political constructs, not biological facts. The science of racial superiority was always pseudoscience, designed to justify theft, violence, and power. Charlotte's existence proves it was never about biology. Truth has a way of surviving, even when powerful people desperately want it to disappear. Who was the last Black Queen of England? Technically, it was Queen Elizabeth II, who died in 2022 carrying the same African ancestry that Charlotte brought into the royal line. But the real answer is, there never was a last Black Queen, because the British establishment never acknowledged there was a first one. They erased Charlotte's heritage for 250 years. But erasure isn't the same as non-existence. She was real. Her ancestry was real. And that truth finally demands to be told. Today you learned how portraits were whitewashed, how bloodlines were hidden, and how an empire built on racism carried the very ancestry it enslaved. If this opened your eyes, hit subscribe, because we reveal suppressed stories like this every week. Share this with someone who needs to know that Black history isn't separate from royal history. It's woven through it. Drop a comment. Should the royal family authorize DNA testing to settle this forever? Here's the question that matters most. What other truths are waiting to be uncovered? Remember her name, tell her story, and refuse to forget the truth.